It's great to be here again. I think this is maybe the fourth time I've been invited here at the course to tell you something about our experience with patient reporting, and also to share some international experiences. As Elke has said, I'm working at the Netherlands Pharmacovigilance Centre, Lareb. I've been there for more than 12 years now. I did my own PhD on a subject of patient reporting. And we have colleagues just finishing their PhD or still working on it. And we are also a WHO collaborating center on pharmacovigilance in education and also patient reporting. So that's why it's also very nice to be here and tell you something about this subject. First, I want to start with a question. Who of you comes from a country where patients or consumers can report ADRs themselves? Well, that's good. Good for me to know that quite a few colleagues are coming from countries where patients can report. But for others, this might be a new subject, and I hope to give you some insights on how you can work with patient reports. So I will start with an introduction, then I will talk you through some of the practical issues that you may encounter if you have a patient reporting system or want to set up such a system. I want to share with you some ideas on the quality of the reports made by patients, especially in comparison with the healthcare professional reports, how you can use these reports for signal detection, and then I want to show you some sources of other information and recommendations that we got from other countries that we received during studies that we did. So first, an introduction. And this is a sort of a review article published last year saying that you can improve pharmacovigilance through direct patient reporting. And if I say direct patient reporting, what I mean is that it's a report initiated by a patient or consumer without there being an interpretation of the information there by a healthcare professional. So why would you allow patients to report? Actually, there are countries worldwide who have experience with patient reporting for many, many years. For instance, in the US, the FDA has allowed patients to report since the early 60s. Also, for instance, in Australia and Canada, patients could report themselves quite early since the pharmacovigilance systems were set up. But in other countries there was much more discussion, and as I can see in this audience here, not all countries allow patients to report. Well, there were a lot of pros and contras mentioned in the literature, in the early literature, let's say in the early 2000s, about why it would be beneficial or would have drawbacks to allow patients to report. And one of the reasons that people were maybe a bit hesitant to allow patients to report is that you would have, there was a fear that you would have an enormous amount of reports coming in that were non-serious and all known, and that it would make, for instance, signal detection be much harder. And also, the reports that you would get would be non-medically confirmed. And a lot of centers were hesitant to think, what would I do with these reports? On the other hand, we know that there is an enormous amount of underreporting by healthcare professionals. And maybe patient reporting would be a way of getting at least that information about ADRs that you wouldn't get in another way. And also, patients might report information to you that you might not get from the healthcare professional reports. Maybe they report a different type of ADR than healthcare professionals do, or about a different type of drug. For instance, on over-the-counter medicine, or medicines that you would buy without a prescription that are unregistered, for instance, like herbal drugs. So pros and contras were being mentioned in the literature. And also at our own center, we were hesitant in the beginning because, it's a big step to allowing the system to be opened up to to consumers. At least it was for us when we started in 2003. And we really needed to make a culture change from a drug-oriented organization to a more patient-oriented organization. But I think what we feel now is that the message in the reports is of importance and not the messenger. It's about getting good reports, and for us it doesn't matter whether it's a patient or a healthcare professional report. If the information is in there and is good, we will use it. So why would patients actually want to report ADRs? Well, we did a study on that a couple of years ago where we looked at patients' motivation. When we started with patient reporting in 2003, one of our concerns was that patients wanted to report mainly because maybe they were unhappy with their treatment and they would like us to do something about that, or would want advice or complain, or so we really thought, well, let's investigate what the motivation for them is to send that info to us. And we did qualitative interviews with patients followed by a large questionnaire study. And what we looked at was patient characteristics, so who are the patients who report to our center, and we also looked at their reasons for reporting. And what we found actually is that altruism, wanting to do some good for other people, even when it's not beneficial for yourself, is the main reason why patients report, at least in the Netherlands. But I guess it would also be a universal reason for reporting. And also the severity of the adverse drug reaction was something that sometimes startled patients. They had read about the ADR in the patient information leaflet, but they didn't know that it would affect them so much. For instance, itching is mentioned in the patient information leaflet. But if you just read the word, you don't know how it will affect you when you actually experience that ADR, and it can be maddening. You can really suffer from it. And that is an ADR that maybe healthcare professionals wouldn't report to us anymore because it's known and it's in the leaflet. But patients really show you the severity of that ADR, and that's our reason for reporting. And also, patients just wants to share their experience. That was an important reason for reporting. They had suffered from this ADR and they just wanted to share that experience with the Pharmacovigilance Centre. And I think this is a good quote. I'm not going to read it out loud, but you can read it yourselves. This is one of the patients from the interviews we did saying that the reason why he reported was just the ADR happened to him, he will get his treatment from the physician, but he really wanted to make sure that other people could benefit from his experience. So I think this is a good quote showing that altruism is a main factor. So in Europe, I don't know how many of you are from European countries, but there has been a shift in focus in legislation. Patient reporting is now mandatory in Europe. And a lot of countries, even in Europe, had to start since 2012, had no system in place, and had to start with setting up a patient or opening up their system for patient reporting. And really, if you start, it's quite a challenge to implement a system where you can have patient reporting which is efficient, where you can use data optimally and capture the unique features of the info that patients can report to you, but is manageable within your own resources. Because of course each center has their own budget, has their own resources, and as much as you want to do, you would have to work within your own budget. So I'm going to share with you some practical issues on what it means to have an efficient patient reporting system and what you would have to do, make sure before you start with this. So they have to know where to report, it has to be easy, they have to know where to find you, but as you say, they also have to be encouraged to report. They have to know why they're doing it. Because I agree, otherwise You can have everything in place, but if patients don't know why it's important, you won't reach them. A couple of years ago, a guideline was developed in this monitoring medicines framework, where there were best practices described for implementing a pharmacovigilance system. And we also did, our center for this monitoring medicines project did a review of countries to see what kind of best practices there were in countries who had already had patient reporting for a longer period, and also countries who were just started. And I just want to share some practical experiences from those two issues with you. So first, the guideline, it's safety monitoring of medicinal products, and then a reporting system for the general public. And you can find it online on the WHO website. And it's just a guideline with some basic steps that you need to think about if you're starting. And really one of the main things is when you're thinking about patient reporting is that you have a good functioning healthcare professional reporting system in place. Because really I'm talking about patient reporting, I think it's a very important subject, but you need to have your system for the healthcare professionals in place in order to have a good functioning patient reporting system as well. Because if you have that, you will have staff which are knowledgeable how to handle spontaneous reports. If you just start a center without ever working with spontaneous reports, it will be very hard. So if you have a good functioning healthcare professional system in place, you can build from there. You already have some ideas on a reporting form. And that reporting form can be tweaked, or you could have a separate reporting form from patients, but you know what kind of basic fields you would need to use the information. And of course, this is a reporting form, but it can be multiple ways of reporting. You can have the telephone reporting, as was mentioned. You can think about an app. There's all kinds of ways that you could allow patients to report. But of course, first, you need to think about what kind of information do I need. You need to have procedures for assessing reports in place already, whether it be case-by-case reporting that you do, or case series assessments, whether you're a bigger center who does statistical analyses already. You will have that experience in your center if you work with healthcare professional reports already. And you will need a database for storing the reports. So what if you have that basic set in place? What you then need to do is really get your health authorities and patient or consumer organizations to back you. Of course, you cannot work with such a system if you're all alone. Of course, you need your health authorities to support you. And it's really a good idea to involve consumer or patient organizations from the start. They can help you to think of all kinds of practical issues like how readable is it? Will patients be able to find you, your website, your organization? Can you help them to make information on your center available to patients, for instance, on their websites or newsletters? So you need them to help you. You need to think of your reporting form and make it patient-friendly, user-friendly. So no difficult terminology. You need to have it in layman's language with additional help questions maybe. Also think about what you want to get from the patients. For instance, if you think that maybe they won't be able to describe the ADR as adequately as healthcare professionals, ask them for photos. Have an upload function in the ADR reporting form. For instance, if they're reporting a skin reaction, photos can be very helpful. So think about what kind of info you would want from them. For instance, free text. How much free text will you allow? How will you get the ADR? Will you make them tick boxes or write it in free text? Then you will need to train your staff. If they have already worked with healthcare professional reports, of course they know how to do the causality assessment. But there are some things that are different with patient reports than healthcare professional reports. For instance, it can be more tricky to code. Healthcare professionals most often will tell you the medical term, or will be brief, just tell you the medical term. Maybe they will send you a discharge letter, all the info is in there. Patients might use their layman's language to really describe the ADR. And you will need to learn how to code that. For instance, if you're using Medra, how to transform the text that they send you into Medra codes. And you will need to see how you're going to use your database, if you're going to put the patient reports in there with your healthcare professional reports, or use a separate database. So there's all kinds of reporting methods. As was already mentioned, you can use telephone lines where you allow patients to report. You can have apps, e-forms, you can let them send a text message and call them back. There's all kinds of ways of allowing to report. And you have to think about your own center and your capacity, your budget, what reporting way would be good for you. And also, what kind of info do you need? Would you make all the fields mandatory, for instance, in an app report or in a reporting form or not? Would you allow ADR, the free text for ADR description? Will you ask them for additional info, like I said, photos maybe, or some patients have their own lab values, have discharge letters. Will you allow them to upload these? And it also depends on what you're allowed to ask them in your own country's privacy laws. We only, at Lareb, we only have an electronic format and an app. And I will tell you why we did this. Because when we started in 2003, we really thought about how many reports do we expect to come in? What is the capacity of our staff? How much time will it cost us to handle those reports? And we decided that we didn't have the capacity to have a telephone line open for patients to report. The internet use is very high in the Netherlands, even among the elderly, and almost everybody, every household has a computer. So that's why we decided, we think that with an electronic form, we can manage to get a large amount of reports in our database without it costing us too much extra capacity. And also, we wanted to make sure that we had the data in a structured manner and that we had the data we wanted to have. So we made some of the fields mandatory. So we now have an electronic reporting form. It allows for easy access because everybody can find the website, at least that's what we hope. They can have the form there. If you would use paper forms, you could distribute it maybe through pharmacies or in hospitals, but in this manner you always make sure that patients get a form if they want. Of course, if they really can't use the electronic form, we will send the paper form to them, or we will allow them to report through telephone. It's not that black and white. We won't say, no, we don't want your report if you can't use it online. Use the form online. But this is our basic method. The electronic form is also flexible. It's easy to make amendments to the form and not having to have an old form in there in distribution everywhere. It eliminates a lot of the manual data entry, and if you have more reports coming in, data entry can be quite a lot of work. So with this, the data is put in the form by the patient itself, downloaded into, let's say, the website, and you code it. We have a form where you can upload photos but also movies. You can have a PDF of a discharge letter. And for over-the-counter medicines, we ask patients where they bought it. If they bought it if they bought it at a health shop, for instance, or a pharmacy, and if it's not a regular pharmacy but a website, you can put the URL of the website in there. So that's how we do it in the Netherlands with our form. We also have an app at the moment, which is a little bit more of a, let's say, easier form. It doesn't have that much mandatory fields as the normal form, and we've investigated the quality of the first reports coming in, and there were a little bit less quality than the normal reports, but good enough to use. So the app is really also a way that you could use. If you then get the reports to your center, you need to think about how am I going to handle them. And it depends on your organization how you want to handle them. For instance, some organizations have regional centers that are very close in contact with the healthcare professionals. Maybe you want that for the patient reports as well, but maybe not. You need to think about how are you going to share the reports with international databases like the Vigibase. How are you identifying patients in your database? What kind of fields do you have for that? For instance, are you allowed to ask them for their birth date and store that? You need to have some kind of duplicate detection in place, at least if you're getting a bit larger set of reports. There can be duplication between patient and healthcare professional reports. I have to say, for us, in our center, it's very rare that we get a duplicate. But we have an automated duplicate detection in place, and sometimes it does pick up a report being sent in, for instance, by a medical specialist and the patient itself. But it can also happen, for instance, that the GP sends it in, also the pharmacist. You need to think about the possibilities for follow-up, and I think this is really important for the patient reports. Because they can be less clear sometimes than the healthcare professional reports, and it's very good that you can ask follow-up if you're able to do that. And I think our experience is that patients are very willing to give you that info. Most of the time they're happy that you're looking at the report and that you are interested enough to ask them follow-up questions, and they're very happy to send it to you and make things more clear. And I think their willingness to send you follow-up is much higher than for the healthcare professionals. So even initially, if a report might be a bit vague or you don't know exactly what kind of product was used, it can be all kinds of things that might not be clear. You can ask the right follow-up questions, and a lot of the time you will get that information. At least that's our experience. Some countries would like medical confirmation for patient reports. I think there's a downside to it, that if you want that for all the reports, that it's a lot of work and you won't, probably you won't get it. Of course, if you have medical confirmation, the quality of the report can sometimes be improved, but you also need to think about when you need it. I mean, if there's a patient who reports, for instance, a headache or another kind of ADR, that he or she is really able to describe very well, would you need medical confirmation to go forward with that report? That is something that you need to think about beforehand. For us at our center, we rarely ask it. Only if we're working on a signal sometimes, or it's a very severe report, we would ask them maybe if they would want the healthcare professional, they would ask the healthcare professional to send us additional info. But as I said, for most reports, we rely on what the patient reports to us. So other practical issues. I said coding could be an issue, because in our experience, healthcare professionals report medical terms. They often report syndromes, and for patient reports you can have more that the symptoms are reported separately and not the syndrome itself. especially if it's a patient report where the patient might not have gone to the healthcare professional yet or is in the middle of investigations, then it can be quite tricky on how you want to code it. For us, we adhere to the meta points to consider. That's something that we look at for coding. And you really need to train your staff, if you're doing this, to all code in a similar manner. I think that's important. What you then also need to think about is how you're doing the causality assessment. If it's done the same way for the patients and the healthcare professionals, for us it's exactly the same assessment. Although sometimes you would need follow-up information to make the report as clear as possible. What I really think is important is the narratives in the reports from patients. That is where I think their additional value lies. You can really get information on how severe the ADR was, how it affected them, how it affected if they could go to work, for instance, what kind of treatment they received. And often that information, the narrative, is much more, elaborate than the info from healthcare professionals. And I think one of the challenges of working with patient reports is not just receiving this info, but making use of it. Because it's not just about serious ADRs, it's not just about ADRs which are unknown. A lot of the ADRs you will get are about known phenomena that are in the SMPC, but still they might contain a lot of information that you could use. For instance, if you have a telephone line where you answer healthcare professional questions, you could use this info. Or you can use it in articles that you write on ADRs. You can make use of that additional info. But then you need to look at it and really think on how you're going to use it. So not just store it. Also, what is important is providing some kind of feedback. And this is an article that we wrote about feedback expectations from patients. We've done the same thing a couple of years ago for healthcare professionals. But we also wanted to know what patients expect to get back from us when they report. Of course, we know now from our previous study that, for instance, altruism is a major factor, but still, what are their expectations when they do a report? So what we wanted to know is it necessary to provide feedback, personalized feedback to each reporter? It's something that we've done for more than 20 years for all the healthcare professional reports. We sent them a really quite in-depth personalized feedback because we review each case they sent in on a case-by-case manner and do a causality assessment for individual reports. And we think for the healthcare professionals, it increases knowledge, awareness, it increases the reporting rate, and also gets us to have some relation with them. They get something from us, and hopefully they are willing to send in more data or follow-up questions. But for the patients, we weren't sure if that was exactly the same. So we were sending personalized feedback to patients, we still are, and information that we send is the drug ADR association, whether or not it's described in the SMPC, sometimes literature info, and reports in our database. And I have to say, for the healthcare professionals, this is much more elaborate than for the patient reports. Because for patients, there is a large difference also in how they're educated. You can have patients who just have a very primary education to patients who are doctors themselves and who really know how to process the information you send them. But beforehand, you probably won't know their underlying knowledge. So it's quite hard to assess that beforehand. So this is what healthcare professionals get, and it also contains some general info, and you see that the red part is kind of the personalized info that is sent. And patients get almost the same info, get personalized feedback, but get it more in layman's language. And we tell them more whether it's mentioned in the SMPC or not, or if we do have more reports. But it should be understandable for them. And when we did this study, what we found, we surveyed a large group of people who either got a feedback or not. And what we found is that they're satisfied either way, whether they get a personalized feedback, so the red part in there, or just the black areas, where we give them some general info. They were a bit more satisfied when they get personal feedback, but they weren't unsatisfied if you just send them a general acknowledgement letter. But the general acknowledgement letter should contain info that is desired by them. And some of the things that is desired by patients that they expected to get or would want to get is very difficult to give. But other things are actually much easier and really help them to see what you're doing with the report. For instance, patients would really like to know how you process their reports. What happens with those reports? Are they stored in a database? What happens to them? Things that are very clear to us, working in pharmacovigilance, might absolutely not be clear to them, how you're going to move further. Sometimes patients have the expectation that they send in their one report and immediately all kinds of actions will take place. So you can have a paragraph in a few sentences explaining them what you will do. They would like information on the causality. Sometimes you can give that if you're doing it in a personalized manner, but not always. The frequency of the ADR. If it's a known ADR, frequencies are often known, for instance, from the label. That's something that you might be able to give. Recovery of the ADR. Maybe you know from other reports what percentage of how many of the patients recovered or not. Or if it's an ADR which is expected to recover. This is something that the acknowledgement of receipt is something that is easy to give and really desired by patients. They just want to know if you got the information. So even if it's an easy thing to give, you will make them satisfied by doing this. Well, advice for further treatment, that is something that they often would like. We never give it because it's part of their treatment. What you can say is suggest to them, if they have further questions, go to your healthcare professional. And actions that took place in response to the report, you can have some general info. What we actually do is also, if we have a signal later on where their report was used, they get an information on the signal sent to them as well later on. And a lot of patients appreciate that. So we talked about a lot of practical issues, but what is the quality of reports? What do they actually report? And this is a study that we did on our own data, looking at what kind of info is reported by patients and what by healthcare professionals. And we looked at different groups of healthcare professionals as well, because you might not be surprised that there's differences if it's a medical specialist and a pharmacist report. What kind of info is in there. Overall, healthcare professionals had a higher score of the presence of objective information. And objective information, for instance, for pharmacy reports, is the batch number, for instance. That is something that a pharmacist will give you. Or the exact dosage that the patient received. It's also in the pharmacy reports. For instance, a medical specialist were able to give you more info on lab values. So that is objective info. And subjective elements of information for the patients is the more elaborate narrative that they send you, where they explain to you what their how they experience the ADR. So what the impact on their life was, on their quality of life, for instance. But also there were some objective elements. For instance, the weight and the height of the patient is something that patients will tell you and can be useful in some reports. and you won't get that from healthcare professional reports. So the course, the outcome, a detailed description of what happened, of the severity, if they've been in contact with different healthcare professionals, that was more often reported by patients. And as I said, this is information that can be useful, especially if you, if it's not just the ADR is known in the SNPC, but if you want to see, well, how does it impact patients? What are the circumstances of use? How do they actually use it? This info can be very useful. So the healthcare professionals reported more on the dosage, pharmaceutical form, other suspect medication, and a diagnosis with clinical tests was more often reported by the specialist doctors, but also more often reported by the specialist doctors, not just in comparison with the patients, but also with general practitioners and the pharmacists. So the info in the reports differs a little bit, but if you then look at the quality of the clinical info, this is another study that we did, looking at, let's say, duplicate reports, pair reports. We searched our database for all the reports that were reported by both the patient and the healthcare professional. And we then compared them. It was a set that we gathered in the last 15 years, and we looked, well, if you have these reports on the same association, what kind of info do they give you? And we used a structured tool. We looked at different elements of information, and we calculated how much they were comparable to each other. Almost 200 cases included, and what we saw was that in a lot of cases, the level of clinical information, if you look at all these different fields of info that patients or healthcare professionals can give you, was similar. There was no difference. And then in about the other half, some patient reports were better, some healthcare professional reports were better. But overall, with this whole analysis, we couldn't find a statistical difference. So the info was as good from the patients as for the healthcare professional reports. Of course, this is only a study on our data. It doesn't say that data from another country wouldn't have differences there. But still, I think it's reassuring that if you have a good form and you ask maybe follow-up questions, and you would have like help texts telling patients what you need, that they are able to give you good clinical information. So if you have good clinical information, then you might want to use them for signals. So can you actually do signal detection on these reports? So here Sherlock looking for signals. And here I've put in some other experiences from other countries as well. For instance, the UK colleagues have had experience with patient reports for many years now, and they have a more of a statistical way of looking for signals than we do. They don't do a case-by-case assessment for all reports coming in, but they looked at disproportionality. So if you have a set with healthcare professional reports, and you look at the level of disproportionate reporting of associations in there, was that higher or not than if you would combine it with patient reports? And actually they found more possible signals based on those statistics if you combine the patients and the healthcare professionals, including some serious reactions not previously known in the SNPC. For us, we very recently looked at the last 5-6 years and saw, well, if we look at all of our signals, what is the contribution of patient reports there? It's something that we've done earlier, but as time progresses, we have broadened our scope of what kind of signals do we look at. You have more experience with working with the reports. And what we saw now is that more than a quarter of all the reports in the signals are from patients. So we get a lot of reports, but those reports do end up in signals as well. And there are a few signals solely based on patient reports, or mostly based on them, where I think that that signal wouldn't have existed without patients. But there are also signals entirely based on healthcare professional reports, but more and more it's really a mix, where we have both. So I think in our situation, it's mostly that you would have maybe 20 reports in a signal, and that there's a couple pharmacist reports, there's medical specialists, there's patient reports in there. We all mix them together, look at the quality, and use them all for the signal. And we use the strength of all those reports for the signals. For instance, the patient reports might tell you something about the severity. The pharmacist reports might have good information on co-medication, and some other reports might have other features. So we use them all. Also, in the signals, all the patient reports that were used there, more than 30% contained a term listed as an important medical event. So you might think that the patient reports are all non-serious that you receive, but that's not the case. There are serious reports in there, which also end up in the signals. And we also compare it with the healthcare professional reports on what type of signal would patients have an additional contribution to. Actually, it's very spread out on all system organ classes. There's not one type of signal that you can find with patient reports. We did see that there's more, at least in the Netherlands, drug substitution is something that patients report a lot about. We had some signals on substitution, for instance, from brand to generic medication, or different generics compared to each other, where patients had a large contribution. I would have to say together with the pharmacy reports as well. And also patients reported more about psychiatric ADRs in the signals. And that is also something that I think they're very able to describe what happens to them. But we are not the only ones who have found signals with patient reports. These are just a few that we found during an earlier study. Colleagues from the Philippines, and this is a couple of years ago, they had just started with patient reporting. They had a very limited set, but they found some counterfeit, problems with counterfeit drugs in the Philippines. And that is something that I think is very useful, because maybe you won't find those problems as easy with the healthcare professional reports. But patients have bought these products, maybe not through their regular pharmacy, and they discovered these issues. In Sweden, the Medical Products Agency has found a signal with a herbal product that caused liver problems. Also, I think this is one of the gaps you might have with healthcare professional reports, that they often don't know what kind of other medications a patient is using. For instance, herbal drugs or vitamins, as our own signal is about. The colleagues from Australia, they have the official Pharmacovigilance Centre, the TGA, but they also have this adverse medicines event line that patients can call to make their report, and those reports are sent to the official center. And they had a signal on zolpidem and all kinds of sleepwalking related. Zolpidem is for sorry?
Insomnia.
Yes, for insomnia. And they had all kinds of sleepwalking related issues. And of course, this is a known ADR, but actually some severe accidents happened because of the sleepwalking issues. Because patients got into their car while sleepwalking and had, for instance, an accident with a car. And I think it's a very interesting signal, where you might be focused on the sleepwalking, but it might be much more severe than you would think. For us, I put two examples. What I really like is that we had a signal years ago on azathioprine and photosensitivity through healthcare professional reports. And then when we discussed it in the Netherlands, it was deemed it's not strong enough to put it in the SNPC yet. Later, a couple of years later, we had a cooperation with a patient organization, with patients using this drug, and we had like a reporting campaign among that patient organization. And then we got a lot more reports, just spontaneous reports about the photosensitivity, because they were triggered to report their ADRs. And the signal was strong enough then with that additional info. So I really like that you, through the help of a patient organization, could get that info to really strengthen a signal. And also we had a signal on really high dose vitamin B6 products and neuropathy. And yeah, it's a signal, I think, where patients really were able to provide info on drugs or on products, vitamin products, which were not registered in extremely high dosages, bought, for instance, on the internet, leading to these complaints, where a lot of them also had investigations in the hospital to look at their vitamin B6 blood levels, and were able to provide us with that info. You can also use the global database for patient reporting. We did, this is not just in the national centers, together with the UMC colleagues. This is a poster with very small lettering, so I won't expect you to read everything. But we, in the end of 2016, we did a sprint on the database, a signal detection sprint, where we especially looked at patient-reported signals in the global database, in the Vigibase. And we were able to pick up some signals where you can really see what matters to patients, what associations that they would find important to report. And for instance, there were new signals in here. For instance, the pregabalin and the visual color disturbance that was not mentioned in the SMPC, quite new. But also other things that for a healthcare professional might be entirely clear, for instance the amitriptyline and the dry eyes. But for a patient, if you don't think about pharmacology of a drug, might not be clear at all and is missing from the patient information leaflet. So this was published in the signal document. I'm almost to the end. I just want to show you some more info and recommendations that we got from previous studies where we really looked at best practices in a lot of countries. A lot of countries said, important is if you receive reports, make information available. Make sure that, for instance, on your website you tell patients what happens to their report. Maybe make signals available in a layman's language summary. Or your publications, think about making it available through patient organizations. You can find all kinds of ways of making your info available, but just make sure that you're not just writing information that is very aimed at the healthcare professionals and doesn't reach the public at all. Of course, you need to think about what is manageable within your own organization, so that you're not, so that it doesn't, the workload isn't too much. What is important is promotion of your system. A lot of us are afraid that once you allow your system to be open to patients, you will get swamped by reports. But that most often isn't the case. You won't get swamped, at least that's our experience. In the beginning, it was a few hundred reports. And in a lot of other countries who have started, it's tens of reports. It's not that you would get thousands right away. It's the other way around. A lot of patients, most of them, will not have any idea that they can report to you. So it's important that you will let them know who you are and that they can report. So we did a questionnaire study in 2015 looking at how mature patient reporting systems are worldwide and what kind of support systems would need to develop their patient reporting systems better. And I would just give you some results of the study. Patients in a lot of countries nowadays accept patient reports. About a quarter doesn't, at least from the ones in our study. And we had a very high response. So the reason for not having an official patient reporting system is lack of resources, budget, or lack of information, education in the country itself, where you think, well, is this useful to do here? For instance, if you have a lot of illiteracy in your population. Most of the countries that we surveyed agreed that patient reporting can add to pharmacovigilance, together with the healthcare professionals. But they also say, if we want to promote the systems and handle those reports coming in, we need more budget. We need resources. And of course, that is something that is hard. That balance between working with reports, getting them, but also how are you going to promote the system on the budget you have. And a lot of countries said that being able to promote to better their system, they would need more information. For instance, trainings, maybe conferences, but also maybe articles or other information on just experiences from other countries on how to do it. And I think that's why it's so important that if you're working with these reports in your own country, publish about it. Just share that information so other countries can use it. Of course, from Lareb's perspective, we have published quite a lot, but we're in Northern Europe, and our experience might not be valid for countries everywhere. So it's good if you have your own experiences to try to make them available for other colleagues. Well, do patients actually know that they can report? In the Netherlands, with all the work we've done, less than 17%, and this was a result from a survey, know that they can report. So more than 80% doesn't, and I think it's much lower in other countries, probably. So even in our country, promotion is desperately needed. If you want to reach patients, you need to promote it. But you have to make sure that it's within your researches. So how can you do it? Of course, you can use traditional materials like leaflets and posters, but they cost money to print and to distribute. So what works for us is working with patient organizations. Often they're quite willing to help you, to promote you, and that's more freely available to do. Also, you can think of more expensive ways like commercials or internet commercials or on radio and TV, but you can also use your own website to do it. Make sure that patients can find it, or have a social media page that is very good where patients can find you. So options that are maybe within your resources. Consumer magazines might be very happy to get info from you. We have collaborations with a couple of consumer magazines where we write like a monthly column on an ADR. And it's sometimes about simple ADRs like photosensitivity and what you need to think about. Just some general information, but it's very useful for patients to read, and those magazines are very helpful, very happy to receive that info from us. So it's beneficial on both sides. So if you want to look at social media campaigns or examples for this, a part of the European Scope project was a campaign on Facebook and YouTube. This is all in Dutch, but it gives you an idea of kind of pictures that were developed. But I also want to show you that we've had this article in Drug Safety where a lot of the info that I'm telling you now has been summarized. It's our own experiences, but also experiences from our survey that we did with 11 other countries. And this article here where we really shared what we've learned over the years. And also our Swedish colleagues did the same. Also Scope, the Scope project, you can look on this website here, Scope Joint Action. It's in the European context, but it has a lot of info that you can use. For instance, work packages on ADR collection, things that you might look at. And also my colleague, Leon, has just finished her thesis on patient participation in pharmacovigilance, and you can also find this online. So just Google it and you will find the whole PhD thesis. And a lot of the things I've described in this this presentation is from her thesis as well. So what I want to conclude with is that we are the collaborating center for pharmacovigilance in education and patient reporting. Don't hesitate if you have any questions regarding patient reporting or to contact us. We will be very happy to give you some info. And to summarize, I think this is really the value of patient reports. They can help you with finding reports where healthcare professionals maybe won't. You can use them for signal detection. Patients sometimes report different ADRs, especially in blind spots in pharmacovigilance. For instance, the over-the-counter, the herbals, illegal products. But importantly, you get information about impact on daily life, the severity, what circumstances they used it in. And then this is my take-home message. I think that really using patient reports helps us to broaden our insight on the safety of drugs. And with that, I want to conclude. If you have any more questions, email me. Or ask them now.